President Barack Obama has signed into law the so-called Promesa bill, which will establish a federally appointed control board with sweeping powers to run Puerto Rico's economy. While the legislation's supporters say it will help the island cope with its historic debt crisis by allowing an orderly restructuring of its $72 billion in bond debt, critics say it's a reversion to old-style colonialism that removes any democratic control by the people of Puerto Rico over their own affairs. On Thursday, the president signed the legislation as an important first step in helping the island regain financial stability.
Some amazing work by our Treasury Department, our legislative staff, and a bipartisan effort in both the House and the Senate. We finally have legislation that at least is going to give Puerto Rico the capacity, the opportunity to get out from under this lingering uncertainty with respect to their debt, to start stabilizing government services and to start growing again. It's not in and of itself going to be sufficient to solve all the problems that Puerto Rico faces, but it is an important first step on the path of creating more stability, better services, and greater prosperity over the long term for the people of Puerto Rico.
Earlier this week, the Senate voted 68-30 in favor of the Promesa bill just days before Puerto Rico was expected to default on a more than $2 billion debt payment, which it has today. New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez led the opposition to the bill.
It is a vote to authorize an unelected, unchecked, and all-powerful control board to determine Puerto Rico's destiny for a generation or more. It is a vote to force Puerto Rico, without their say, to go $370 million further in debt to pay for this omnipotent control board, which they don't even want. It is a vote to cut the minimum wage down to $4.25 per hour for young workers in Puerto Rico. It's a vote to make Puerto Ricans work long overtime hours without fair compensation. It's a vote to jeopardize collective bargaining agreements. It's a vote to cut worker benefits and privatize inherently government functions. It's a vote to close schools and shutter hospitals and cut senior citizens' pensions to the bone. It's a vote to put hedge funds ahead of the people. And it's a vote to sell off and commercialize natural treasures that belong to the people of Puerto Rico.
That was Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. Democratic presidential candidate and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders also spoke out against the legislation. Meanwhile, Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois spoke in favor of the Promesa bill.
What's the alternative if we vote no? And you'll hear a lot of members saying, let's just vote against this and put an end to it. The alternative if we vote no is to give the bondholders, those who are holding the debt of Puerto Rico, all the cards July 1st, all the cards. They can then go to court and force their hand for payment on these debts. And Puerto Rico, which is struggling to provide basic services, will have even more money taken away from them. What is a disastrous situation will become disastrously worse if we vote no and do nothing. This oversight board, for all its flaws, has the power to stop that from happening, has the power to enter into voluntary negotiation on the debt of Puerto Rico, and if they can't reach a voluntary agreement, they have the power to go to court for restructuring on all of the debt that faces that island. Now, that is significant. I hope it doesn't reach that point. I hope there is a voluntary negotiation. But to say that we are going to protest the creation of this board by voting against the creation of the board and this outcome that I've described is to throw this poor island and the people who live there into chaos.
That's Senator Dick Durbin. Also this week, in Puerto Rico, demonstrators in opposition to the Promesa bill have established an ongoing protest camp outside the U.S. federal court in the capital city of San Juan. Well, for more, we host a debate. In Washington, D.C., we're joined by Eric LeCompte, the executive director of Jubilee USA Network, which has backed the Promesa bill. And here in New York, we're joined by longtime labor activist Jose La Luz, who's an opponent. He organizes, promotes, and advocates for worker rights in Puerto Rico and the United States. La Luz has retired from the American Federation of State County Municipal Employees, or AFSCME, and now works as an advisor to the AFSCME affiliate Civil Service Employees Association. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Will the bill pass? So, Eric LeCompte, your thoughts today?
Well, essentially, the legislation is incredibly important. There can be no economic growth in Puerto Rico before the debt is restructured. Unfortunately, without this legislation, Puerto Rico had no protections to pay its to pay pensions, to pay teachers, and to pay social services. So it's incredibly important. I know your listeners are very aware of the Argentina situation and what happened when a group of vulture funds essentially held that South American country hostage for nearly 16 years. Puerto Rico was about to become the next Argentina. The same types of vulture funds today, if the legislation did not pass, would have swooped in, bought the debt for pennies on the dollar, and held Puerto Rico hostage. Where Argentina is a relatively wealthy country, as it caucuses with the G20, we're talking about an island, Puerto Rico, where 60% of the people live, of the children live in poverty, where 45% of the people live in poverty. The rates are just staggering. They're unbelievable. And what happened with this legislation passing is the vulture funds were told they're not allowed to come to the party. So we prevented Puerto Rico from becoming the next Argentina. This is absolutely crucial to understand. It's also absolutely crucial to understand that because the president signed this legislation yesterday, last night the governor of Puerto Rico was able to declare a debt moratorium and announce that the pensions that have been being taken from for years to pay the debt are now going to be able to pay back. That social services are going to be paid on the island, that there's going to be protections for children and reducing poverty. So even though there are concerns with the legislation, and we've worked in the legislative process and been able to address many of these concerns, we haven't been able to address all of them. But we knew that there was no alternative, and if we didn't act by today, the vulture funds were being invited to the party, and Puerto Rico was about to become the next Argentina.
Jose La Luz, what about that? Your thoughts and this issue of whether the vulture funds have been stayed by the legislation passed by the Senate?
The truth is that this colonial junta is nothing but a glorified collection agency for the hedge funds and the vulture funds. In fact, everything that Eric explains is precisely the reason why this is such a bad piece of legislation. There is absolutely no protections, no provisions to protect pensions, collective bargaining rights, worker rights. There will be a sub-minimum wage. But the most serious consequence of this is that this takes us back to the days immediately after the U.S. military occupation of the island, before the Foraker Act. This is a very, very serious, very seriously flawed piece of legislation. We are deeply disappointed that Jubilee USA, a Catholic organization which has been known consistently for its defense of working families in other parts of the world, has taken such a position. We suspect it may have something to do with the relationship that Mr. Lecomte himself has with the Archbishop of San Juan, Roberto Gonzalez, who terminated the pensions of the Catholic schools employees unilaterally, who shut down Catholic schools. So this is, in fact, something that paves the way for a feast, for a field day for the hedge funds and Wall Street, and it has serious and grave consequences, because now we will witness a sustained, consistent, and escalating resistance of people in Puerto Rico, which will have serious consequences in terms of the relationship with the United States. I think that Mr. Lecomte must realize that his organization has made a very serious mistake in supporting this piece of legislation.
Eric Lecomte, your response?
Well, I agree with some of the concerns that Jose raises. I don't think he understands the legislation. I don't believe that he's read the legislation. I think that we've seen a lot of compromises to address the particular issues he's raising, but we have to understand we do work with the religious leaders in Puerto Rico, and we do believe the religious leaders, the Catholic Church in Puerto Rico, the Pentecostal leaders, the evangelical leaders, the head of the Bible Society, have been the real hero in this. For the last year, they have been the most outspoken group about the effects of the debt crisis, the growing tragedy where nearly 60% of kids live in poverty. When we talk about a liquidity crisis, when we talk about legislation not passing today, that means a lot more than the choices that teachers are making in Puerto Rico about whether or not to turn on the computers today or whether or not to turn on the lights today. It means more than law enforcement getting cut. It means more than health care getting cut in the face of the Zika virus. We have to understand that right now in Puerto Rico, for the past few months at the Central Hospital, sick kids at the only newborn neonatal special care unit have not been able to get direct access to dialysis. They haven't been able to get access to life-saving drugs. Kids in the center there can't get access to chemotherapy drugs because they don't have credit. They can only do cash on demand. And as limited as the credit crunch was becoming already on the island, if the legislation didn't pass, we were going to see things even become more worse. Now, with the Archbishop of Puerto Rico, who's been very outspoken about the legislation and concerns about the legislation, who worked on both sides of the aisle with representatives like Nydia Velázquez and Jose Serrano, who came to bat on this legislation, we know that they have had the best interests of their people at the heart of this. They have been the ones most outspoken about the crisis, and we've worked with them closely for a year, working on every possible solution. And our work doesn't end today. There's still a lot more work to do, but we've worked on solutions at the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury, the White House, and then put pressure on Congress to act. I think it's really important that we need to understand what Archbishop Roberto Gonzalez, the Catholic Bishops' Conference, and the religious leaders said in Puerto Rico. The legislation has to pass in order to stop the humanitarian crisis. It has to pass and move forward in order to reduce child poverty. At the same time, they reminded all of us that the problems in Puerto Rico and this current crisis is a direct result of the island's colonial status. And in order to stave off the next crisis, we have to address the colonial status on the island. But we have to also understand that without passing this legislation, the vulture funds would have swooped in. Without passing this particular legislation, there would have been no protections to pay pensions, to pay teachers, to pay firefighters. Essentially, what we would have had in Puerto Rico was a great invitation for the vulture funds. In terms of, I think, some of the concerns that we have...
I'm going to interrupt for a minute because we have to break, but when we come back, we'll also, of course, get response from labor activist Jose La Luz. Eric Lecomte is Executive Director of Jubilee USA Network. We're talking about the passage of the Promesa bill that President Obama has signed off on. Today, Puerto Rico defaulting on its $2 billion debt repayment. We'll be back in a minute.